so much, Dr. McCullough and John, for your time today. I really do appreciate it. I know that you're very busy people, and I was very excited to learn that you were here in Dallas through a Facebook post that said you had been at something, and I was like, oh, I missed it. So when I looked up your office, I thought, oh, if I could get an interview, that would be so exciting, because a lot of us in Australia were just very pleased to hear a doctor speaking critically about some things that people weren't willing to discuss. So it's great to have critical thinkers, which we need in the scientific medical community.
It's so true, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to McCullough Foundation offices here in Richardson, Texas, in Dallas-Fort Worth area. Texas is about the size of Australia in terms of population. Australia is a bigger landmass, and John Leak, our Vice President of McCullough Foundation, and myself had a chance to visit Australia, tour the country in 2023, and we were shocked with the stories we were told about Australians and this grossly disordered groupthink that settled in among your government leaders.
You're an epidemiologist. Some people don't know what that is. Could you just briefly explain?
I'm in practice as an internist and a cardiologist. I'm board certified by one of the major boards in the United States, but I'm also trained in epidemiology. I trained at University of Michigan, and epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of disease. It's the discipline of evaluating diseases as they arise in populations.
That's great. What were your concerns around early treatments for COVID-19, what you were seeing?
Well, maybe John can kick it off by explaining what we heard was the narrative about the virus.
It became apparent to us independently when this first happened. We weren't in contact. We only discovered later that we were neighbors. But both of us were impressed by what seemed like a kind of classic narrative of a monster is coming. A boogeyman is coming, and he's coming for all of us. It's a respiratory viral illness emanating out of Wuhan, China, and boy, is it deadly, and there's no distinction between ages or fitness or anything. It's coming for all of us, it's deadly, and all we can do is obey whatever mandates the government presents us with based on official public health directives. I think one of the things that we both observed very quickly is, on the one hand, this was represented as a novel coronavirus. At the same time, our federal health authorities seem to already know everything there was about it. If there were independent doctors in the field saying, well, I'm looking at this, I'm treating patients, I'm finding that certain combinations of drugs take the edge off of this, our federal health agencies immediately said, no, nothing works as a therapeutic. All we can do is stay at home, wear masks, social distance, and wait for a vaccine.
Or until we're so sick we have to go to emergency.
Well, I should say that the first thing was we have to wait for a vaccine. If you should fall ill before a vaccine, the heralded savior vaccine, arrives, the attitude was pretty callous. It was, well, sorry, there's nothing much we can do for you. If you get really, really sick and can't breathe, then go to the emergency room and we'll kind of do the best we can. But there was no attempt to offer any kind of hope, or it was almost like, and I think you had the same perception, it was almost like those who fell ill before the arrival of the heralded vaccine, it's almost as if the intention was precisely that they should feel despair. They should feel hopeless. There's nothing that can be done.
Or in fact, they should be sacrificed. I mean, this is a terrible thought, but I can tell you as a doctor, all forms of pneumonia should be treated immediately at the first day of illness. So we always treat all forms of pneumonia at home. there's not a single form of pneumonia that we would say wait at home for many days. In fact, on average, it's 2 weeks before people are sick enough to come into the hospital. It violated every aspect of good clinical practice.
And every illness, early intervention, right? That's what we cherished. Yet doctors who used early intervention treatments were demonized.
Well, the doctors who attempted to use empiricism, that is to make observations, and what we had done with the published McCullough protocols is find groups of different drugs or agents that could be organized into a sequential protocol based on signals of benefit, acceptable safety, and our empiric observation. Doctors who tried that, they were censored quickly. There was severe professional reprisal. There was a delicensing, and people lost their jobs. And then, if you look on the other side of this, not a single Australian hospital or university or medical school came up with their own protocol.
Dr. Thomas Borody came up with a triple protocol in Australia. He was a Nobel Prize winner, and ivermectin was part of it. And it astounds me that a drug that had Japanese wonder drug, 2011, I quote the NIH, "There are few drugs that can seriously lay claim to the title of wonder drug. But ivermectin can also be considered alongside the worthy contenders of penicillin and aspirin, based on its versatility, safety, and the beneficial impact that it has had and continues to have worldwide, especially on hundreds of millions of the world's poorest treatments." So we have a drug that's been around for a very long time. It's got a safety record almost better than aspirin, and yet this drug is demonized, and we're told, it's a horse drug. If you take it, you're being absolutely stupid. We're not allowed to think critically. Physicians were not allowed to think critically.
John covers this in our first book. I'll hand this over so John can talk about this war that was waged on ivermectin.
Yeah, and the connection with Australia is interesting because it was some researchers is it the Monash University who first observed, just doing these in vitro studies, that a culture of SARS-CoV-2, the causative agent of COVID-19, in vitro with ivermectin, it was an absolute astonishing reduction of viral replication. And they published their findings in the spring of 2020. And what was remarkable about it is there were particular pulmonologists, particularly a husband and wife pair named Rajter in Florida, who had a private pulmonology clinic, critical care for pneumonia. They noticed the Monash study, and they thought, well, that's remarkable. It seems to have potent antiviral effect, and it has this brilliant safety record. It's actually, the original manufacturer of ivermectin was Merck. Merck did toxicity studies. They amped up the dosing like 100 times higher than the normal dosing for river blindness, and they found very, very little toxicity, even at ultra high doses. So, for example, this husband and wife team in Florida said, well, this is like one of the safest drugs around. It seems to have potent antiviral effects. The other thing that was quickly discovered, coronavirus, like influenza virus, has a protein on the surface called hemagglutinin, which is a combination of Greek and Latin for blood glue. It actually clumps the red blood cells together. And they discovered ivermectin breaks up this hemagglutinization, this clumping of the red blood cells. So, by all appearances, this could be really a marvelous therapy in treating this. Rajter and the husband and wife team, they published a very great case series in a very prestigious journal called Chest, Journal of Pulmonology. And instead of, hallelujah, it looks like we have something that really works, it was relentlessly demonized. As you said, it was compared to horse paste. We had a full propaganda flood the zone in the United States in October of 2021. On the same night, Saturday night, we have these, they call them late night comedy shows.
Mm-hmm.
All of them, there's like 5 of them, on the same Saturday night, they all had this lambasting and this ridicule of the horse paste, the so-called horse paste ivermectin. And that's when we realized this is a massive propaganda campaign to take ivermectin out behind the woodshed and shoot it.
In the United States, it was so bad that 3 doctors, one of them based here in Texas, sued the FDA for their false campaign against ivermectin. And in court, lawyers for the FDA backed down, and the FDA removed all of their false claims about ivermectin being only an animal product. And so that tells you when government agencies themselves have to be brought to court, that tells you that something has gone very wrong in the pandemic response. And there are countless examples now. At the time of this interview, we're days away from a Senate appearance of Dr. Anthony Fauci, our senior White House coronavirus coordinator, who his diary indicates full-blown megalomania. And when John and I visited Parliament in Australia, John specifically asked members of Parliament, who or what did you rely on to formulate your response to the pandemic, particularly the vaccines? The answer was, we relied on the Americans.
Completely. I was so stunned by this one senator in particular who said, we completely deferred to the judgment, the evaluation of the American FDA. And I said, so you mandated that all of your people be injected by a genetic technology developed by an American company with a very long criminal and civil rap sheet. Pfizer has a very, very spotted past. And a German company in Mainz, and a company in Mainz, Germany, foreign product, foreign regulatory agent. The regulators in Australia completely deferred to this commercial enterprise and its friends in the regulatory business in America in order to mandate this. I said, I said, it's unfathomable to me that you as a legislature who are responsible for the well-being of your people would just prostrate yourself to the Americans in this matter. I still don't understand it. What happened to Australia? I mean, that's a subject for an interview unto itself. What happened?
Yeah, so my view is that there is a coordinated effort, and you hear about Event 201, which is a worldwide event where they did shortly before 2019 a how do we respond to a pandemic, and it's almost like they did exactly what that event suggested
a coronavirus
across
pandemic.
the whole world. They then locked us all down, and in the state of Victoria, as you're aware, I often say we have a communist government, because really the Nuremberg Code was made so we're never forced to take a medical treatment, because they knew, especially an experimental drug, right? And yet here we are being told you cannot work, which I was one of many who lost their jobs. You cannot go and eat in a restaurant with other people if you don't take this. You cannot go to church with more than 12 people unless you're all vaccinated. You could still go to brothels, but you couldn't go to church. I thought, to me, that was astounding. I'm like, where are you going to get close contact? A brothel or a church? Like, come on, let's. If this is really a medical thing, we would not have such incongruent rules forced upon us as a population.
Do you know the most severe reprisal experienced during the pandemic was leaders in the faith community? This is interesting. More than doctors, nurses, or politicians. And so who comes to mind is Art Pawlowski, who is a pastor at a Calgary, Alberta church, who refused to close his church during the pandemic. The Canadian authorities came for him, they arrested him, and they put him in solitary confinement, turned off the lights for 3 months straight. 3 months straight. He sat in a cold black cement block with a toilet in there, and they handed him his meals under the door for 3 months. So, when we look at this, you can't, I think, be more alarmed at the behaviors of what we saw. We saw people stripped of their rights. We saw senior citizens hospitalized. They couldn't see their loved ones. They were denied early treatment. They died without any connection with their family.
And died of loneliness.
They died of loneliness. That people's businesses were wiped out. 60% of businesses in the United States that closed during the pandemic, they never reopened. Those losses are real.
Not to mention national debt, right? Like, we never used to have much debt in Australia 20 years ago, whereas now we've got in our state $70,000 per household worth of debt in the state, plus another $60,000 federally per household. Like, the spiraling debt in Australia, every household carries $130,000 of government debt.
John, what did the pandemic do to our national debt?
This is very important. There's a financial analyst named Ed Dowd who's really gone deeply into the financial aspect of this. I had a conversation with him a couple of years ago, and we were really having the same perception. I noticed in October of 2019, there was an article in Forbes magazine stating that the Italian government is basically insolvent. They're in a debt trap. Their population demographics, they're never going to get out of this. And the question was, given that all of these central banks still have so much debt on their balance sheet, it's almost like we need another crisis in order to seemingly justify another round of credit expansion. And that's what we saw across the country. Now, there were across the world. There were countries like Italy that were already mired in debt. So was the United States. But what we saw is COVID became this pretext for grossly expanding credit. To give you an idea of how extreme this was in the United States, on March the 26th, 2020, Congress hastily passed the CARES Act. It was a blanket legislation for the COVID pandemic response. With the stroke of a keyboard, it created $2.2 trillion out of thin air and dispersed it to various interest groups that were purportedly in the business of countering the pandemic. And so this looks like a massive pretext for saddling the peoples of the world with debt. The other element to this, ultimately, we could talk about all of this malfeasance for many, many hours. The ultimate question that we settle on, and we've written 2 books about it. Doctor, I think you have our other one. What we see is, in the same sentence, in the same paragraph, whenever there's any kind of public health representation of what we're dealing with, you'd have, at the same time, early treatment doesn't work. There's nothing that anybody can do to take the edge off of this illness. Nothing works. Ivermectin doesn't work. Hydroxychloroquine, even nasal rinses, nothing works. All we can do is wait for this vaccine, which we're working on at warp speed. And so you begin to realize, okay, so we're all meant to feel despair and fear and to stay at home and accept that the world's turned on its head. But as Bill Gates explicitly stated in an April 2020 media interview, there's nothing that we can do. We can only go back to normal when basically everyone on Earth gets the vaccine. Well, he said this in April of 2020. The vaccine had just begun human trial. It's as though he already knew it was going to get through the trials.
And remember, back then, treatments hadn't been trialed
That
yet.
hadn't even been tried.
So it was
yeah.
an
Oh,
a priori
crazy.
statement that treatments were not going to work, that we shouldn't even try. And then even when treatments came out, so the first government Operation Warp Speed treatment was bamlanivimab. That came out before the vaccines. That was safe and effective. It was an expensive government product. The government said, no, we can't supply it. They even though they had actually made enough doses to treat the entire country, they made it difficult to get. Within a few months, took it off the market, put another one on the market, took it off the market. So whether the treatments were generic and inexpensive, over-the-counter or prescription, or expensive Operation Warp Speed, high-tech monoclonal antibodies, which I use, and I can attest, the clinical trials show they save lives. The government suppressed all of that, all over the world, including the United States and Australia, to feature one solution, and that was vaccination. And it wasn't just any vaccination, it was genetic vaccination.
Yeah, the mRNA. You mentioned nasal spray. I want to give something very practical people can have. When you were in Australia, you came down with a cold and you used a formula. Can you tell our viewers what you did?
I did. I went to an Australian pharmacy. They had a wonderful mint flavored iodine in a small dropper. I added that to some water, a little packet of salt that I got from an Australian restaurant. I made a saline iodine solution, and I used that multiple times per day. So I squirted up each nostril, I sniffed it back, spit it out, gargled with it. And that solution helped me through a viral illness. And I can tell you, there are now a bevy of trials showing a whole array of nasal sprays and gargles worked, including those used in the hospital. And it's a tragedy that even people in the hospital were denied nasal sprays and gargles. A close friend of ours, the CEO of the Clear Corporation, Nate Jones, he was sued almost immediately in 2020. Both him and his company, he was sued for COVID misinformation, and he was offering a completely safe solution of a nasal spray and gargle.
And he was sued not because his company was issuing representations of the efficacy of the nasal spray. He was sued because his company on their website published completely independent university research that they didn't even commission. In other words, not only can you not produce any kind of studies of your own,
But you can't tell the public about ones that have been done.
you can't even mention other studies.
But think about this targeted reprisal. It was the Clear Corporation and Nate Jones personally. He was personally being sued by the U.S. federal government. And this went on for years. It cost him millions of dollars. He held his ground and ultimately prevailed. But we have seen this time and time again of professional reprisal taken out against individuals, sure, doctors, nurses, therapists, and others, but also against companies. Companies paid some of the most severe price that we've seen. We've seen this in the religious community. There are pastors, I mentioned Art Pulaski, who was imprisoned. There were other, Tony Spell in central Louisiana, also brought to prison 3 times because he would not close his church. And then others were actually demoted, and they lost their positions in the religious hierarchy. And while at the same time, the Vatican issued this coin. John, maybe you want to describe this coin that we put on the cover of our
Yeah,
book.
let me hold that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so I began to perceive that what we were looking at was something like this monolithic, there's only one thing that could save mankind. There's only one thing that could liberate mankind from this state of being locked down and wearing masks and children couldn't go to school. There's a liberator and there's a savior. This sounds kind of archetypal, doesn't it? And
It
almost
does.
every religion, almost like a messiah. So you can imagine my shock when you might hold that up so that the maybe even like that. Yeah. So it's a 20 euro silver coin. issued by the Vatican in the year 2022 commemorating the COVID-19 vaccine. And what I thought was particularly interesting, in the Numista catalog, the coinage catalog of the Vatican, it issues different coins and medallions and so forth. The description of this: a young person prepares to receive the vaccine. Now, people who are familiar with the Catholic liturgy, so you would say a young person here in the presence of the clergy prepares to receive the Eucharist. So it's as though the vaccine is a kind of savior that you're taking instead of the Holy Communion, which we associate obviously with the Roman Catholic Church. Never mind the Vatican itself. It's not the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. It's the new sacrament of the vaccine.
Yeah, it's quite sad how some religions did almost look and do look to the medical world as the savior instead of, Jesus is the great physician, the great healer. Things that God has created. Like I think about, I just used comfrey. I tripped and I had quite a sore hand and I used comfrey on it, a balm. And it's incredible the healing power, within a day of all the pain and the movement is all back to normal. But these treatments are demonized, things that God created naturally, because they can't make money off of them. They can't control them.
One brief mention for COVID-19 of a natural substance that was just remarkable was vitamin D. And vitamin D was also castigated by the government. Even the Mayo Clinic cast doubts about vitamin D in SARS-CoV-2 infection, yet every single study showed those with a higher level of vitamin D seemed to be protected against severe disease. There were 7 prevention trials, prospective randomized trials, randomizing people to vitamin D versus placebo, that showed vitamin D was protective against the development of COVID, and that those who took vitamin D in the hospital, they had less severe outcomes. So something as simple as vitamin D was demonized. It was across the board. The only thing that was promoted by the US government, the Australian government, was the COVID-19 vaccine, which turned out to be not safe and not effective. So here we are sitting today in 2026. There's not a single prospective double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial demonstrating the COVID vaccines reduced hospitalization and death, adjudicated as a primary endpoint, not a single trial. There's not a single valid observational study. When I mean valid, a valid study would have to have vaccinated, unvaccinated, and control for prior infection, natural immunity, early treatment, and milder forms of the virus. They have to account for that in order to kind of see the truth. None of those exist. In fact, the papers that exist, one by John Ioannidis in New England Journal of Medicine, simply claims the vaccine saved lives, multiplied it times the world's population and an infection rate, and declared the COVID vaccine saved millions of lives. It's simply a house of cards. It's based on false assumptions. I don't want anybody out there to think that the COVID-19 vaccines saved millions of lives. Australia is the test example of this. Australia was pre-vaccinated, received SARS-CoV-2 late in the evolution of the pandemic, and Australia has some of the most stark statistics of having 100% of people in hospitals with severe illness and sadly death fully vaccinated.
Yeah, New South Wales was the only state in Australia where they actually published the real data on vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and I was fascinated to watch how they, as soon as they could, they hid all that because they realized it wasn't doing what they wanted it to do. We had...
It's not a confidence builder.
We had politicians, the virus is going to come and get the unvaccinated. Like, that's literally what the politicians
going to hunt
said.
The unvaccinated.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, if I could conclude with this, an astonishing thing is that our own Director of Health and Human Services in the United States, in August of 2021, she had to come out and admit, Rochelle Walensky, She had to just come out and admit, well, it would seem that the vaccine does not prevent transmission and infection. But then she hastened to add, but it does reduce severity of the illness. Well, as the doctor said, I mean, this was just an assertion. There was no evidence to back this up. In other words, you're still getting it. You're still getting infected. It starts up here in the nose, and then it works its way down to the lungs. You're still getting it. And this was the remarkable thing. He has seen in his clinical practice people who received the vaccine but then got COVID multiple times.
Or very sick. I remember one guy saying, oh, thank God I got the vaccine. I was so sick. Imagine how much worse it would have been. And
Right.
I was like, I didn't get the vaccine. And when I got COVID, it was like a cold.
None of us took the vaccine, and thankfully none of us will suffer the complications of the vaccinated. And I want the audience to be clear that there are now thousands of peer-reviewed manuscripts demonstrating the COVID vaccines cause heart damage or myocarditis, resulting in heart failure and cardiac arrest. They cause neurologic illnesses like Guillain-Barré and transverse myelitis that paralyze patients, stroke, disabling. They cause blood clots. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And now revelation is that our former senior White House court advisor, Anthony Fauci, suffered a vaccine blood clot several months after taking his Moderna shots, and he kept it quiet to,
Of
in a
course.
sense, allowing more people to suffer these blood clots, and the world is furious about this. The vaccines clearly cause autoimmune conditions because they continue to produce the spike protein, the dangerous part of the virus, inside cells and outside cells for years after administration. Work by the McCullough Foundation showed 3.5 years after the shots, Pfizer is still circulating in the bloodstream producing spike protein. And then lastly, a fifth area of great concern, not proven, but great concern, is that the vaccines may actually increase our risks for cancer.
Yeah, I've heard that there's got to be some reason we've all of a sudden got this explosion of cancer, very aggressive cancers that are often found late.
Well, we're greatly concerned, and we're going to conclude this video. And Ms. Colbert, thank you so much for visiting us here in Dallas, Texas. People in Australia and all over the world, in my view, should support her efforts and efforts of people like her who actually can see what's going on. A small number of people in leadership positions around the world, and it's interesting, it's just a tiny percent, can see what's going on. And we use that term awake. They're awake to what's going on. The COVID-19 controversy, the vaccine debacle, is part of a bigger picture that you are working on. This is an important book concerning child sexual abuse. And John has a book out regarding how infectious thoughts spread from one to another.
Yes, Australians would find this interesting. And you also observed how this so-called gender dysphoria that we were suddenly, in my new book, which was just published 2 days ago, Mind Viruses, you will suddenly have an irrational thought that would not have been countenanced by any reasonable person just a few years earlier, and suddenly, almost like a viral contagion, this irrational thought or belief will be rapidly and wildly embraced. So suddenly we're told that there is an epidemic of adolescent, even prepubescent children who are suffering from the belief that they're not of their biological sex. Now, a reasonable person would say, well, but I mean, they're children. They've not yet developed an identity or an awareness or an understanding of sexuality. Like, what on earth are you claiming? But our public health authorities, like the COVID-19 vaccine, rushed to embrace this fraudulent concept of gender dysphoria in minors. And so it's a topic for a whole other discussion, but I'm glad that you are engaged in this because it's yet another act of gross malfeasance.
We've concluded that we've entered a time of controversy. Excessive childhood vaccination, the autism epidemic, the transgender crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic and debacle, wars erupting all over the globe. Something is going on, and we need people like you in leadership positions worldwide. Everybody, thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much for your time. God bless.